The next morning, the fallout began. Local news outlets had already picked up the story. Their headlines splashed across websites and social media. Prominent doctor accused of financial misconduct. The comments were worse, filled with thinly veiled racism and outright vitriol. At the cafe, Teresa handed Elijah a cup of coffee with a grim expression. "It's spreading fast," she said, glancing toward the door where a few regulars had gathered, their murmurs barely audible but unmistakable. "I know," Elijah replied, his tone measured. "That's exactly what they want." Teresa leaned in, her voice low. "You need to fight this. If they win, the health center's done for." "I will," Elijah said. "But first, I need to find out who's behind it." His opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Elijah received an anonymous tip. A message slipped under his office door, written on a torn piece of paper. It read, "Check the council's private accounts. Hayes has more to hide than you think." Elijah stared at the note, his mind racing. If Hayes was involved, it explained a lot. The councilman had always been vocal in his opposition to the health center, but this accusation of financial misconduct suggested something deeper, something personal. Determined to get answers, Elijah contacted Margaret Hensley, one of the few allies he had on the council. They met that evening at her home, a modest brick house on the edge of town. Margaret greeted him with a worried expression. "Elijah, I heard what happened. This is outrageous." "It's more than outrageous," Elijah said, stepping inside. "It's deliberate. Someone's trying to sabotage the health center, and I need your help to prove it." Margaret nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "What do you need?" "Access to the council's financial records," Elijah said bluntly. "There's reason to believe Hayes is involved in something shady, and I need evidence." Margaret hesitated. "That's a serious accusation." "So is what they've accused me of," Elijah countered. "Please, Margaret, if we don't expose this now, they'll win." After a long moment, Margaret sighed and nodded. "I'll see what I can do." By the next morning, Margaret had come through. She handed Elijah a flash drive containing the council's financial records, her expression grim. "You didn't get this from me," she said. Elijah nodded, slipping the drive into his pocket. "Thank you." Back at his office, Elijah combed through the files, his heart pounding as he uncovered transaction after transaction linking Hayes to dubious deals, kickbacks from local contractors, inflated budgets for personal gain. And there, buried among the records, was proof that Hayes had orchestrated the complaint against Elijah, using a proxy to file the accusation. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him. He had the evidence he needed, but bringing it to light would come at a cost. Hayes wouldn't go down quietly, and Elijah knew the fight ahead would be brutal. As he prepared to confront Hayes, Elijah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the corruption that had plagued Willow Creek for far too long. That evening, Elijah received an urgent call from Teresa. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Elijah, you need to get to the cafe. Now." "What's wrong?" he asked, already grabbing his keys. "It's Hayes," she said. "He's here, and he's not alone." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm on my way." As he drove through the darkened streets of Willow Creek, his mind raced. He didn't know what Hayes was planning, but he was done playing defense. It was time to take a stand. The cold night air hit Elijah like a wave as he stepped out of his car and onto the cracked asphalt in front of Molly's place. The cafe's familiar glow was muted tonight, its windows dimly lit and casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. Teresa stood by the door, her face pale and drawn. She glanced nervously over her shoulder as Elijah approached. "They're inside," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hayes and two others. They've been asking about you, making threats." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Did they hurt you?" Teresa shook her head quickly. "No, but they're looking for dirt. They said something about making sure you're too busy defending yourself to finish the health center." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay outside, call Margaret, and tell her what's happening. I'll handle this." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure," Elijah said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Teresa hesitated but nodded, stepping away as Elijah pushed open the cafe door. The moment he entered, the conversation inside fell silent. Hayes sat at a table near the back, flanked by two men Elijah didn't recognize. They were large and broad-shouldered, their postures radiating intimidation. Hayes leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Well, well," Hayes said, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. "The man of the hour." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He took a moment to assess the room, noting the tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Then, with measured steps, he walked toward the table. "What are you doing here, Hayes?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but cold. Hayes chuckled, feigning innocence. "Just having a chat with some locals. It's a free country, isn't it?" Elijah stopped a few feet away, his gaze locked on Hayes. "If you've got something to say to me, say it." The two men beside Hayes shifted slightly, their eyes narrowing as they sized Elijah up. Hayes leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You've been making waves, Dr. Brookfield," Hayes said, his tone low and dangerous. "Stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his composure. "Trouble? You mean holding you accountable for the corruption you've been hiding?" Hayes' smile faltered for a split second before returning, colder this time. "Big words for someone under investigation. People around here don't like outsiders meddling in their business." "Outsider?" Elijah said, his voice rising slightly. "I was born and raised here. I know this town as well as anyone, and I know the health center is exactly what it needs." Hayes leaned back again, his smile fading. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about health care. It's about control. People like me built this town, and we're not about to let someone like you tear it down." The words hit Elijah like a slap, but he refused to let them show. "People like you," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Corrupt, selfish, and terrified of progress?" The larger of Hayes' companions stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Watch your mouth," he growled. Elijah met the man's glare without flinching. "Or what?" For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Finally, Hayes raised a hand, signaling for the man to sit down. "Easy," he said, his tone smooth. "We're just having a conversation." Elijah's eyes didn't leave Hayes. "Is that what you call it? Or is this just another attempt to intimidate me?" Hayes chuckled again, but there was no humor in it. "Call it whatever you want. Just know that people are watching you, Brookfield. They're waiting for you to slip up." "I'm not the one slipping," Elijah shot back. "I've seen the records, Hayes. I know what you've been doing." Hayes' expression darkened. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Careful," he said quietly. "You're playing a dangerous game." "No," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I'm ending one." As Elijah turned to leave, one of Hayes' men reached for his arm. Before he could react, the door swung open, and Officer Daniels stepped inside, followed closely by Grayson. "What's going on here?" Daniels demanded, his gaze sweeping the room. Hayes leaned back in his chair, a smug grin returning to his face. "Nothing at all, officer. Just a friendly chat." Daniels' eyes narrowed as they landed on Elijah. "Dr. Brookfield, we need to speak with you." "Outside." Elijah's stomach tightened, but he nodded. "Of course." As he followed Daniels out into the night, he could feel Hayes' gaze burning into his back. Outside, Teresa was waiting, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "What's this about, officer?" Elijah asked, his tone calm but firm. Daniels crossed his arms, his posture stiff. "We've received another complaint about you, Doctor. This time, it's about threats made against a member of the council." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Threats? That's ridiculous." Daniel shrugged, his expression indifferent. "Maybe it is, but I gotta follow up. Come down to the station, and we'll sort this out." Teresa stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "This is harassment. You're just trying to scare him." Daniels ignored her, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "It's your call, Doctor." Elijah glanced at Teresa, then back at Daniels. "Fine," he said, "but this won't go the way you think." At the station, the interrogation was brief but heated. Daniels pressed Elijah on his confrontation with Hayes, twisting his words to paint him as the aggressor. But Elijah, armed with both his composure and the truth, refused to be cornered. "This is a waste of time," Elijah said finally, leaning forward in his chair. "If you want to talk about threats, start with Hayes. He's the one trying to sabotage the health center." Daniel smirked. "That's a bold accusation, and it's backed by evidence," Elijah shot back, "which I'll gladly share with the council and the media if this harassment doesn't stop." For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his smirk faltering. Then he stood, nodding toward the door. "You're free to go. For now." Elijah didn't wait for further explanation. He left the station with his head held high, his resolve stronger than ever. When Elijah returned home, Teresa was waiting for him on the porch, Margaret beside her. They stood as he approached, their expressions a mix of worry and determination. "What now?" Teresa asked. Elijah glanced toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. "Now," he said, "we take this public." Margaret nodded. "I've been in touch with a reporter in Greenville. She's willing to run the story, if we can give her the evidence." "We can," Elijah said, his voice firm. "And we will." As the three of them stepped inside, Elijah felt a new sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the odds were shifting in his favor. Later that night, as Elijah reviewed the evidence one final time, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You don't know what you're getting into. Drop the health center, or you'll regret it." Elijah stared at the message, his resolve hardening. "I don't back down," he murmured to himself, deleting the text. The stage was set, and Elijah knew the next move was his. The town hall meeting was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and a low hum of murmurs and whispers buzzed like static electricity. The tension was palpable, crackling in the air. At the front of the room, Councilman Greg Hayes stood behind a wooden podium, his polished smile firmly in place. Elijah Brookfield entered through the side door, his head held high and his shoulders squared. The crowd's murmurs quieted as people noticed him. Dressed sharply in a dark suit and tie, he looked every inch the professional, but his eyes carried the weight of weeks of harassment, threats, and battles fought behind closed doors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes said, his voice smooth and commanding, "thank you all for being here tonight. We're here to discuss the future of Willow Creek, and particularly the proposed health center, a project that has sparked significant debate." Elijah made his way toward the front, weaving through the seated crowd. Teresa and Margaret flanked him, their expressions resolute. A few allies in the audience gave him encouraging nods, but the air was thick with hostility from others. Elijah could feel their stares, their suspicion. Hayes continued, gesturing expansively. "While the intentions behind this project may be noble, questions have been raised about its execution. Questions about transparency, funding, and whether it truly serves the best interests of our community." Elijah stopped short, just a few feet from the podium. "If you have questions, Councilman Hayes, I'm more than happy to answer them," he said, his voice ringing out clearly. The room stilled, all eyes snapping to him. Hayes' smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Dr. Brookfield," he said, feigning surprise. "I wasn't expecting you to join us tonight." "I'm sure you weren't," Elijah replied, stepping forward. "But when you're accused of misconduct, it's best to face those accusations head-on." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Hayes' polished veneer cracked slightly, his smile tightening. "Of course," he said, "and I'm sure you'll agree that accountability is crucial. The people of Willow Creek deserve answers." "They do," Elijah said, his tone firm. "And that's exactly why I'm here." Elijah turned to address the crowd, his voice steady but impassioned. "The health center isn't just a building. It's a lifeline for this community, something I wish had existed when I was growing up here. Too many families in Willow Creek struggle to access basic care, and this project is about changing that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But from the beginning, there have been attempts to derail it. False accusations, baseless investigations, and behind-the-scenes sabotage. Tonight, I want to set the record straight." Hayes cleared his throat, stepping closer to the podium. "Dr. Brookfield, while your dedication is admirable, these accusations aren't baseless. The investigation is a sham," Elijah interrupted, his voice rising. The crowd gasped, and Hayes froze. The investigation was fabricated by people who fear what this health center represents: progress, equality, change. Hayes's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, doctor. And I have the evidence to back it up, Elijah said, pulling a flash drive from his pocket and holding it up for everyone to see. This contains financial records linking you, Councilman Hayes, to misappropriated funds and backdoor deals. It also shows that you orchestrated the complaint against me to deflect attention from your own corruption. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and even a few shouts filled the air. Hayes's face turned red, his carefully curated composure unraveling. "This is ridiculous," Hayes barked, his voice cracking. "You have no proof." "I do," Elijah said, stepping closer. "And I've already shared it with the media. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know the truth." Suddenly, Officer Daniels entered the room, flanked by two other officers. His eyes locked onto Elijah, and his expression was cold, predatory. "Dr. Brookfield," Daniels said, his voice booming. "We need to speak with you." The room fell silent again, the crowd watching with bated breath. Elijah turned to face Daniels, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah asked. Daniels smirked. "We've received a report that you're in possession of stolen documents. Hand them over, and come with us for questioning." Elijah's stomach churned. He knew this was another ploy, a desperate attempt to silence him before the truth could come out. "The documents aren't stolen," Elijah said firmly. "They were provided to me by a concerned citizen who wanted to expose the corruption in this town." Daniels stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. "That's not for you to decide. Hand them over, or we'll have to take them, and you, by force." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Teresa stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "This is harassment. He hasn't done anything wrong." Margaret joined her, her expression fierce. "This is an abuse of power, and we all see it." Danielle's eyes flicked to them briefly before returning to Elijah. "Last chance, doctor." Elijah took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't let them take the evidence, but he also couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Slowly, he raised his hands, the flash drive still clutched tightly in one. "I'm not resisting," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm not handing this over either. The people of this town deserve to know the truth." Danielle's smirk widened. "That's your choice." Before Elijah could react, Daniels lunged forward, grabbing his arm. The flash drive slipped from Elijah's hand, and Daniels snatched it up, shoving it into his pocket. "Take him in," Daniels ordered, his voice cold. The other officers moved to restrain Elijah, but the crowd erupted in protest. Voices shouted over one another, demanding justice, accusing the officers of corruption. Teresa and Margaret stepped between Elijah and the officers, their faces blazing with defiance. "You're not taking him," Teresa shouted. "This is illegal," Margaret added. Daniels hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the crowd's reaction. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. "Elijah," Teresa whispered urgently, "we won't let them get away with this. The truth will come out." Elijah met her gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. Then he turned to the crowd, raising his voice above the chaos. "Everyone here knows what's happening," he said, his voice ringing out clearly. "This isn't about justice. It's about fear. They're afraid of losing control, but we won't let them win." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices drowning out Danielle's attempts to regain control. Hayes, now visibly sweating, slipped out of the room, but not before Elijah caught his eye. The councilman's face was pale, his confidence shattered. As the chaos swirled around him, Elijah stood tall, his resolve unshaken. The fight wasn't over, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth was a force that couldn't be silenced. The next morning, as Elijah sat in his office, his phone buzzed with an alert. A breaking news headline flashed across the screen. "Willow Creek corruption scandal. Councilman Hayes under investigation." Elijah smiled faintly, but his relief was short-lived. A knock at the door made him look up. It was Margaret, her expression grim. "They're not done yet," she said. "Daniels and his people are doubling down. We need to move fast." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening once more. Then let's finish this. The town hall felt like the eye of a storm. Council members sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between the growing crowd and the central podium. The air buzzed with tension as murmurs rippled through the audience. Elijah Brookfield stood tall at the podium, his heart pounding but his expression composed. Behind him, Teresa and Margaret flanked him like sentinels, their presence a silent show of solidarity. In the corner, Councilman Hayes whispered furiously to Officer Daniels, their faces masks of poorly concealed panic. "This meeting is out of order," Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. Dr. Brookfield has no standing to address the council. "I have every right to be here," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm but loud enough to silence the room. "And so does every person in this room who believes in the truth." The audience erupted in murmurs again, but Elijah pressed on, his voice steady. "For weeks, I've been harassed, accused, and undermined by people who claim to represent this town's best interests," he said, scanning the room. "But it's become clear that their goal isn't to serve this community. It's to silence anyone who threatens their power." Hayes slammed a fist on the table in front of him. "This is baseless slander." "It's the truth," Elijah shot back, locking eyes with Hayes. "And I have proof." Elijah turned to the projector set up beside the podium and inserted the flash drive Margaret had given him. The screen flickered to life, displaying rows of financial transactions tied to Councilman Hayes and several local contractors. The audience gasped, leaning forward to read the damning evidence. "This," Elijah said, pointing to the screen, "is a record of payments and kickbacks funneled through Hayes's private accounts. Money that was meant for community projects, our parks, our schools, redirected to line his pockets." Hayes's face turned crimson. "This is fabricated. He stole those documents." "These documents were shared by a whistleblower on the council," Elijah said, his voice cutting through Hayes's protests. "They reveal not just financial corruption, but a concerted effort to block the health center. Hayes and his allies fear what this center represents. Progress for everyone, not just the privileged few." Daniel stepped forward then, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Dr. Brookfield, you're making some dangerous accusations. I suggest you tread carefully." Elijah didn't flinch. He turned to face Daniels, his voice unwavering. "The danger isn't in exposing the truth, officer. The danger is in letting people like you and Hayes continue to abuse your power." Daniels' jaw tightened, his composure slipping. "Watch yourself, Brookfield. You're on thin ice." Before Elijah could respond, Margaret stepped forward, her voice ringing out clearly. "No, Officer Daniels, you're the one who should be worried. You've been complicit in this corruption from the beginning." She pointed at the screen, where another set of transactions appeared. "These payments tie you to Hayes' scheme. You've been using your position to intimidate and silence anyone who dares to speak out." The crowd erupted in outrage, their voices echoing through the hall. Daniels' hand twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he glared at Elijah, his eyes filled with venom. "You think you can come in here and tear this town apart?" Daniel spat. "You don't belong here. You never did." Elijah stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I was born here, Daniels. This is my home, just like it's the home of every person you've tried to oppress. And we're not afraid of you anymore." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as the crowd surged forward, their voices a chorus of anger and support for Elijah. Hayes stood, his composure completely shattered. "This is a circus," Hayes shouted, his voice cracking. "I demand order, order," Elijah said, turning back to him. "You mean the kind of order that keeps people like you in power, that silences anyone who dares to challenge you. That ends tonight." He turned to the audience, his voice rising above the chaos. "The health center is just the beginning. If we want real change in Willow Creek, we have to hold people like Hayes and Daniels accountable. We have to stand together and fight for what's right." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy electrifying the room. Elijah felt a surge of hope, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Suddenly, Daniels stepped forward, pulling the flash drive from the projector. "This ends now," he growled, holding it up for everyone to see. "This evidence is stolen property, and it's inadmissible in court." "You're wrong," Margaret said, stepping forward. "That evidence is already in the hands of the state attorney general." "It's over, Daniels." Daniels's face twisted in rage. For a moment, it seemed like he might draw his gun, but the crowd's presence held him back. He turned to Hayes, who was now visibly trembling. "What do we do?" Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniels didn't answer. Instead, he glared at Elijah one last time before storming out of the room. The room erupted again, but this time, the energy was triumphant. Elijah turned to Margaret, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. He stepped back to the podium, raising his hand for silence. "This isn't just about me," Elijah said. "It's about all of us. Willow Creek deserves better. It's time to rebuild this town together." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers filling the hall. Elijah felt a swell of emotion, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. There was still work to be done, and he was ready to face it head-on. As the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached Elijah, her camera crew in tow. "Dr. Brookfield," she said, "do you think tonight's revelations will lead to real change in Willow Creek?" Elijah hesitated, his mind racing with the implications of everything that had just happened. Finally, he nodded. "It's a start," he said, "but the fight isn't over." The reporter smiled. "And what's next for you?" Elijah glanced toward the door where Daniels had exited, his jaw tightening with determination. "Next, we make sure justice is served." The aftermath of the town hall confrontation rippled through Willow Creek like a shockwave. By the next morning, headlines splashed across local and state news outlets. "Corruption exposed in Willow Creek. Councilman Hayes and police under fire." Social media was ablaze with posts and videos from the meeting, some showing Elijah standing firm at the podium, others capturing the moment Officer Daniels stormed out. Elijah sat at his kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Teresa and Margaret were already there, both poring over their phones as they scrolled through the flood of news. "It's everywhere," Teresa said, her voice a mix of amazement and relief. "People are finally seeing the truth." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained cautious. "This is just the beginning. Hayes and Daniels won't go down without a fight." Elijah took a sip of his coffee, his mind racing. "That's why we need to keep the pressure on. We can't let this lose momentum." Later that day, a formal announcement came from the state attorney general's office. Hayes was being placed under investigation for embezzlement and misconduct. A search warrant had already been executed at his home and office, uncovering further evidence of fraud. The councilman released a hasty statement denying the allegations, but his usual confidence was gone. Daniels, too, was feeling the heat. Community members began coming forward with complaints of harassment and abuse of power, emboldened by Elijah's bravery. The local police department announced that Daniels had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, though the public demanded harsher consequences. At the heart of it all was Elijah, his name now synonymous with the fight for justice in Willow Creek. Reporters camped outside his office and home, eager for a statement. Elijah gave one brief press conference, reiterating his commitment to the health center and calling for systemic reform in the town's government. "This isn't just about one corrupt councilman or one abusive officer," Elijah said, his voice steady as cameras clicked and reporters jotted down his words. "It's about creating a system where no one has to fear speaking out, where everyone has access to the resources they need to thrive." The crowd applauded, and Elijah felt a surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. Elijah threw himself into his work with renewed determination, but he also took time to reflect on how the ordeal had changed him. One evening, he sat on the front porch with Teresa, the two of them watching the sun set over the quiet street. Rocky lay at Elijah's feet, his tail wagging lazily as he dozed. "You know," Elijah said, breaking the silence, "I spent so long thinking I had to fight this alone, that if I showed any weakness, it would all fall apart." Teresa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always carried a lot on your shoulders. But look at what happened when you let people in." Margaret, the community, None of this would have been possible without them. Elijah smiled faintly. It's humbling, knowing that the fight isn't just mine, that it belongs to all of us. Teresa placed a hand on his arm. You've inspired people, Elijah. That's what leaders do. He looked out at the horizon, a sense of peace settling over him. Maybe, he said, but I've still got a lot to learn. The Health Center project gained newfound momentum in the wake of the scandal. Donations poured in from across the state, spurred by the media coverage and public support. Volunteers stepped forward to help with construction, and local businesses offered their resources to speed up the process. The town council, now under intense scrutiny, voted to approve the final permits for the project. Hayes's allies on the council had distanced themselves from him, desperate to salvage their own reputations. Meanwhile, a coalition of reform-minded community members began organizing to replace the old guard with leaders who truly represented the people. Elijah attended a community meeting one evening, sitting quietly in the back as residents debated the future of Willow Creek. He watched as people of all backgrounds shared their hopes and ideas, their voices blending into a powerful chorus of change. For the first time in years, Elijah felt a glimmer of optimism. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer his alone. One afternoon, Elijah stood in the middle of the nearly completed health center, the smell of fresh paint and sawdust filling the air. The building was still a work in progress, but it already felt alive with possibility. Margaret joined him, her hands in her pockets as she surveyed the space. It's really happening, she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the bright, open rooms. It is, and it's going to make a difference. Margaret smiled. You should be proud. I am, Elijah said. But this isn't just my victory. It's ours. Rocky trotted in then, his tail wagging as he sniffed around the room. Elijah crouched down to scratch behind the dog's ears, a smile tugging at his lips. We did it, boy, he murmured. We really did it. As the health center's grand opening approached, Elijah found himself reflecting on what lay ahead. The battle for Willow Creek had been hard-fought, but there were still challenges to face. Ensuring the center's long-term success, supporting systemic reform, and holding those in power accountable. One evening, Teresa approached him with a folder in her hands. You need to see this, she said, her tone serious. Elijah opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. It was a report detailing ongoing issues within the police department, patterns of misconduct, unreported complaints, and a culture of silence that went far beyond Daniels. This is just the beginning, Teresa said. If we want real change, we need to dig deeper. Elijah closed the folder, his jaw tightening with determination. Then let's get to work. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting the town in a warm, golden light as Elijah Brookfield stood on the steps of the newly completed health center. The air buzzed with the energy of the small crowd gathered for the grand opening. Children laughed as they chased each other on the freshly paved courtyard. Parents chatted eagerly about the new opportunities this center would bring, and volunteers bustled about, putting the finishing touches on the celebration. Elijah took a moment to soak it all in. The building before him wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of resilience and hope, a tangible reminder that change was possible, even in a place like Willow Creek. He adjusted his tie, his hands steady, and turned to face the crowd. Elijah's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Weeks of threats, accusations, and systemic resistance had tested every fiber of his being. There were moments when he had doubted himself, when the weight of the fight had felt unbearable. But standing here now, he realized how much he had grown. For years, Elijah had relied solely on his own strength, believing that vulnerability was a weakness and that leadership meant bearing every burden alone. The events of the past months had shown him otherwise. The health center wasn't just the result of his determination. It was the product of a collective effort. Teresa's courage, Margaret's tenacity, and the community's willingness to stand up for justice had turned the tide. Elijah had learned to lean on others, to trust in the power of solidarity. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. As he addressed the crowd, Elijah's voice was steady but filled with emotion. This health center represents more than healthcare. It represents the strength of this community and our commitment to each other. It's proof that no matter how deeply injustice is rooted, it can be challenged and uprooted. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had rallied alongside him. What we faced here in Willow Creek is a reflection of larger issues: systemic racism, corruption, and abuse of power. These problems are not unique to this town, and they won't disappear overnight. But what we've done here proves that progress is possible when we come together. The crowd nodded, some clapping softly, others wiping away tears. Elijah knew they understood. The fight for justice was far from over, but the steps they had taken here mattered. Elijah continued, his tone rising with conviction. Every time someone told us to stop, we moved forward. Every time they tried to silence us, we raised our voices. And every time they tried to tear us down, we built something stronger. He gestured to the health center behind him. This is what happens when we refuse to give up, when we believe in each other, when we stand together. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, and Elijah felt a swell of hope. The people of Willow Creek weren't just bystanders anymore, they were agents of change. We've proven that one voice can make a difference, Elijah said. But many voices, united, can transform the world. The fallout from the corruption scandal had sent shockwaves through the town. Hayes had been formally charged with embezzlement and removed from the council. Officer Daniels had resigned under public pressure, and an independent investigation had been launched into the police department. Reform was finally on the horizon, but Elijah knew there was still work to be done. Change doesn't end here, he told the crowd. It begins here. The systems that failed us must be rebuilt, not just here in Willow Creek, but across the country. And it's up to us to hold those in power accountable. His words were met with a standing ovation, but Elijah's voice softened as he added, "This isn't about anger or revenge. It's about justice, about creating a world where everyone has a chance to thrive." As the event wound down, Elijah found a quiet moment to sit on a bench outside the health center. Rocky sat beside him, his tail wagging lazily as children patted his head and fed him scraps from their picnic lunches. Teresa and Margaret joined him, their faces reflecting the same mix of exhaustion and pride that he felt. "Can you believe it?" Teresa said, her voice tinged with awe. "We actually did it." Elijah smiled, a rare moment of pure contentment washing over him. "We did, but it's just the beginning." Margaret nodded, her expression serious. "There's still a long road ahead. But this is proof that we can make it." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, watching the community they had fought so hard to uplift. For Elijah, this wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. The challenges they had faced had stripped away the illusions of fairness and equality that so often masked systemic injustice. But it had also revealed the power of resilience, of refusing to be silenced. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood and looked out at the crowd one last time. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. The fight for justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And while this chapter of the battle was ending, the next was just beginning. "Let's keep building," Elijah said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Let's keep fighting." Margaret glanced at him, a knowing smile on her lips. "We will." Rocky barked in agreement, his tail thumping against the bench. Elijah reached down to pat the dog's head, his resolve hardening. "Come on," he said, leading the way back into the health center. "We got work to do." The health center stood as a beacon of hope, not just for Willow Creek, but for anyone fighting against systems of oppression. Elijah's story was a reminder that progress was possible not because of one person, but because of many, united in purpose and unyielding in their determination to create a better world. As the lights of the health center glowed against the night sky, it was clear. This was more than a victory. It was the start of something much bigger. A successful Black CEO returns to his hometown to establish a health center for underserved families, only to face relentless racism and corruption. As he battles a prejudiced councilman and a racist officer determined to sabotage his efforts, he becomes the target of smear campaigns, fabricated accusations, and systemic abuse of power. This gripping story exposes the infuriating reality of racism in America, where those fighting for equality are silenced and oppressed. The CEO's unyielding determination forces the community to confront its biases, sparking a heated clash between justice and deep-seated prejudice. Dr. Elijah Brookfield adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, his eyes scanning the rows of houses as he walked down the quiet, tree-lined street. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the branches, casting golden hues across the pavement. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had worked hard for his place in the world, yet there was nothing ostentatious about him. His charcoal blazer was tailored but understated, and his shoes, though polished to a mirror shine, were built for practicality rather than show. Elijah, a celebrated neurosurgeon and philanthropist, had returned to his hometown of Willow Creek to oversee the opening of a new community health center, his latest initiative to bridge the gap in healthcare access for underserved populations. The town hadn't changed much since his childhood. The same diner with its faded neon sign, the same hardware store run by the same family, and the same undercurrent of quiet resistance to change. He rounded the corner and stopped in front of a small cafe, its painted sign reading Molly's Place. The door jingled as he stepped inside, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods greeting him. Elijah glanced around, noting the familiar warmth of the space. He remembered coming here as a boy, saving his allowance for one of Molly's famous apple turnovers. Now, the cafe was run by Molly's granddaughter, Teresa, who greeted him with a surprised smile from behind the counter. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. "Well, I'll be," Teresa said, setting down a tray of muffins. Dr. Brookfield, back in Willow Creek. "What brings you by?" Elijah smiled, his tone light. "Couldn't resist a piece of your grandmother's legacy. Is the apple turnover still as good as I remember?" Teresa laughed. "Better if you ask me. Let me get you one." As she moved to the display case, Elijah took a seat at a corner table, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, a group of teenagers walked by, their laughter echoing through the street. It was a scene of quiet normalcy, but Elijah's thoughts were heavier. He knew that not everyone in Willow Creek welcomed his return. Despite his achievements, there were those who saw his presence as a disruption to the status quo. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Marlene, his executive assistant, updating him on the final permits for the health center. He replied with a quick thank you before setting the phone down, determined to enjoy this rare moment of peace. Teresa returned with a steaming apple turnover and a cup of coffee. "On the house," she said with a wink. "You're too kind," Elijah replied, taking a grateful bite. The turnover was as perfect as he remembered, flaky, sweet, with just the right amount of spice. The cafe door jingled again, and Elijah glanced up to see a pair of men enter. They were dressed casually, one in a faded flannel shirt, the other in a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Their eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Elijah before moving on. Something in their posture made him pause. They didn't look like they were here for coffee. "Teresa," the man in the flannel called out, his tone sharp. "We need to talk." Teresa stiffened, but managed a smile. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The man gestured toward the back of the cafe. "Out back. Now." Elijah's hand tightened around his coffee cup as he watched Teresa follow them to the kitchen. She shot him an apologetic glance before disappearing through the swinging doors. The cafe fell silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Elijah's instincts, honed over years of navigating high-stakes environments, told him something was off. He stood and walked to the counter, pretending to examine the pastries. His ears strained to catch snippets of the conversation coming from the back. "Told you to keep it quiet," one of the men said, his voice low but heated. "I'm doing the best I can," Teresa replied, her tone defensive. "Not good enough. We don't need outsiders stirring things up." Elijah frowned. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Teresa's family had always been supportive of the changes he was trying to implement in Willow Creek, and it seemed not everyone was pleased. The kitchen doors swung open abruptly, and the men reappeared. Their eyes flicked to Elijah as they walked past, their expressions unreadable. The door jingled again as they left, and the tension in the cafe seemed to dissipate. Teresa emerged a moment later, her face pale but composed. "Sorry about that," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Just some local business. Elijah nodded, his gaze steady. Everything all right? Teresa hesitated before giving a tight smile. Nothing I can't handle. He didn't press her, but as he returned to his seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was more than just a local dispute. He had seen it before, the resistance to change, the quiet hostility that could simmer beneath the surface of a community. As he finished his coffee, Elijah resolved to follow up with Teresa later. For now, he had a meeting to attend at the town hall, where he knew the real battles would be fought. He left a generous tip on the counter and stepped back into the afternoon sun, the weight of the town's unspoken challenges pressing against him. The fight for the health center and the soul of Willow Creek was just beginning. Elijah adjusted his tie as he approached the steps of the Willow Creek Town Hall. The grand old building stood as a relic of another time, its white columns chipped and weathered. It was the heart of the town's bureaucracy, where every decision about Willow Creek's future was debated and often delayed. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of old carpet. A receptionist at the front desk looked up, her expression briefly neutral before it hardened. Elijah offered her a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm Dr. Brookfield. I have a meeting scheduled with the council about the health center project." The receptionist, a woman in her early 40s with a pinched expression, tapped on her keyboard. "Let me check," she said curtly, barely glancing at him. Elijah waited, standing tall and composed, but he noticed the way her eyes lingered on his clothes, as if searching for a reason to doubt him. After a moment, she looked up. "You're not on the list." Elijah frowned slightly. "I received confirmation from the council's office yesterday. Perhaps there's been a mistake." The woman sighed, clearly irritated. "I'll have to check with someone. Take a seat." Elijah glanced at the worn chairs by the wall, their upholstery faded from years of use. "Thank you," he said, his tone calm but firm. He stepped aside, standing near the entrance rather than sitting. He wasn't inclined to make himself smaller in a space where he had every right to be. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Elijah's patience, a skill honed in operating rooms and board meetings, began to wear thin. He approached the desk again. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even. "Has anyone been able to confirm my meeting?" The receptionist barely looked up. "It's a busy day. You'll have to wait." Before Elijah could respond, the door to the council chambers opened, and a man in a navy suit emerged. Councilman Greg Hayes. Elijah recognized him instantly, a staunch opponent of the health center who had made no secret of his disdain for outsiders meddling in Willow Creek's affairs. Hayes's face twisted into a brief frown before he plastered on a thin smile. Well, Hayes said, walking toward him. "Dr. Brookfield, I didn't expect to see you here today." Elijah extended a hand, his grip firm when Hayes reluctantly took it. "Councilman, I'm here for the meeting about the health center." "Effet de surprise." There must have been a mix-up. We rescheduled that meeting. Didn't anyone inform you?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I wasn't notified." Hayes shrugged, his smile not reaching his eyes. "These things happen. Why don't we touch base next week? I'll make sure someone gets in touch." Before Elijah could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" Elijah turned to see another council member, Margaret Hensley, walking toward them. Unlike Hayes, her demeanor was warm and professional. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "No problem at all," Hayes said quickly, though his tone betrayed his irritation. Dr. Brookfield was just leaving. "Actually," Elijah said, his voice steady, "I was here for the health center meeting. I'd appreciate the chance to clarify a few points with the council." Hensley glanced at Hayes, her expression tightening. "The health center is on today's agenda," she said pointedly. "I'd be happy to escort Dr. Brookfield inside." Hayes hesitated, but he knew better than to argue. "Of course," he said, his tone clipped. "By all means." Hensley gestured for Elijah to follow her, and they walked together into the council chambers. The room was modest, with a circular table and a row of chairs for observers. Several council members were already seated, their conversations halting as Elijah entered. He felt their eyes on him, curious, skeptical, some outright dismissive. Elijah met their gazes calmly, taking his place at the guest table. Hensley sat beside him, giving him an encouraging nod. The meeting began with routine matters, the minutes dragging on as Elijah waited for his turn. Finally, Hayes leaned forward, a practiced smile on his face. Next on the agenda, the proposed community health center, he said. Dr. Brookfield has generously offered to fund this project. I'm sure he has some remarks to share. Elijah stood, his presence commanding but unassuming. Thank you, Councilman Hayes and members of the council. This health center is more than just a building, it's a lifeline. Willow Creek has long struggled with limited access to affordable health care, and this project aims to change that. He spoke with conviction, detailing the center's benefits: free wellness clinics, mental health support, programs for seniors and children. The council members listened, some nodding in agreement, others stone-faced. When he finished, Hayes leaned back in his chair. Dr. Brookfield, your intentions are admirable, but I have concerns about the impact on our town. A project of this scale could bring unwanted attention. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Unwanted attention? Hayes smiled thinly. Yes, outsiders, for instance, people who don't share our values or contribute to our community. I'm sure you understand. Elijah's hands tightened at his sides, but his tone remained calm. Councilman, healthcare is a universal need. This center is for everyone in Willow Creek, regardless of their background. Hayes' smile didn't waver. Perhaps, but some of us are wary of changes that might disrupt the harmony of our town. Harmony, Elijah repeated, his voice quiet but cutting. The kind that excludes those who need help the most. The room grew still, the unspoken tension thickening. Hensley cleared her throat. Dr. Brookfield has made an excellent case for this project. I believe it warrants our full support. Another council member, a man named Carter, spoke up. I agree with Margaret. This health center could be a game-changer for Willow Creek. Hayes' expression darkened. Let's not rush to conclusions. We should consult the community before moving forward. By community, do you mean the people who already have access to care? Elijah asked. His composure was intact, but there was steel in his voice now. Or the ones who have been overlooked for years? Hayes didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening. The meeting moved to a vote, and though Elijah secured enough support to keep the project alive, Hayes' resistance lingered like a shadow. As Elijah left the chambers, Hayes caught up to him in the hallway. Dr. Brookfield, Hayes said, his tone low and cold. A word of advice. Don't push too hard. Not everyone in this town wants what you're offering. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. What I'm offering is hope. If that's unwelcome, perhaps it's the priorities that need to change. Hayes' lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing as Elijah walked away. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Elijah took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about a health center. It was about challenging a system that thrived on exclusion and complacency. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Teresa. We need to talk. Something's come up. Elijah's stomach tightened. He knew the fight was far from over. The knock at the door came late that night, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet stillness of Elijah's home. He glanced up from the papers spread across his kitchen table, the budget plans for the health center glowing faintly under the overhead light. Rocky, his old Labrador, stirred at his feet, letting out a low growl. Elijah stood, his heart already sinking. Visitors at this hour were rarely good news. When he opened the door, two uniformed officers stood on his porch, their expressions unreadable. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, spoke first. Dr. Brookfield? He asked, though it wasn't a question. Yes, Elijah replied, his voice calm but cautious. We need you to come with us, Daniels said, his tone clipped. There's been a complaint. Elijah frowned. A complaint? About what? Daniels exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Grayson, before stepping closer. We've received allegations of financial misconduct related to your health center project. We need to ask you a few questions down at the station. Elijah's chest tightened. Financial misconduct. That's absurd. All of the funds are accounted for. If you'd like, I can provide documentation. That won't be necessary, Daniels interrupted. You can explain it at the station. Elijah's gaze hardened. Am I under arrest? Daniels hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Not yet, but we strongly advise you to come voluntarily. Rocky let out another low growl, his body tense. Elijah reached down to calm the dog, his fingers brushing over the old Labrador's soft fur. He turned back to the officers, his voice steady. I'll come, he said, but this won't take long. At the station, Elijah was led to a stark interrogation room, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. He sat at the metal table, his hands folded in front of him, while Daniels and Grayson stood across from him, their postures rigid. Dr. Brookfield, Daniels began, pacing slowly. We've received reports that funds for your health center project have been misappropriated. Specifically, that you've been funneling money into personal accounts. Elijah's jaw tightened. That's a lie. Every dollar is accounted for. The project's finances are transparent, and the records are available for anyone to review. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Then why would someone make this claim? Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. Because there are people in this town who would rather see the project fail than succeed. Grayson, who had been silent until now, scoffed. That's quite a convenient excuse. It's the truth, Elijah said, his voice firm. If you'd like, I can call my accountant right now and have the records sent over. Daniels crossed his arms. We'll get to that. But first, we'd like you to explain why someone would go to the trouble of accusing you if there's nothing to hide. Elijah's patience, already stretched thin, began to fray. Officer Daniels, this isn't about finances. This is about power. There are people in this town who feel threatened by what the health center represents: progress, equality, access to resources for everyone. They'll do anything to stop it. Daniels smirked, leaning forward slightly. Or maybe they're just tired of someone like you thinking you can come in and change everything. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elijah's stomach twisted, but he refused to let his composure crack. I see, he said quietly. This isn't about the health center at all, is it? Daniel straightened, his smirk fading. We're just doing our job, Dr. Brookfield. Elijah nodded slowly, his mind racing. He needed to get ahead of this, to prove the truth before this baseless accusation gained traction. Hours later, Elijah was finally released, though not without a warning. The investigation would continue, and he was advised not to leave town. He stepped into the cool night air, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Teresa. They're trying to destroy you. Be careful. Elijah clenched his jaw. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about stopping the health center. It was about silencing him entirely.